Hello, today I'd like to talk about what I've learned from 5 years as a pro comic artist and from many years making comics before that. These are tips that I think are somewhat advanced, like they're not the kind of very basic intro tips you will commonly see in other videos, but I think they're still pretty dang simple and that comic artists of any skill level should be able to implement at least some of these in your own work. So here we go. The first tip is something that I came up with that I'm very proud of. It's my secret sauce and my ultimate trade secret, so don't go around telling people about this one. I don't want everybody to know it. But in all seriousness, the first tip is to draw a character's feet on every spread. And I'm using feet as a shorthand for the whole body, partially as a little joke because people really don't like drawing hands and feet sometimes. But essentially, artists, we tend to have a instinct to keep the action really close to the character. So you might be doing a lot of close-ups or mid-shots, and that can make your scenes feel like talking heads or really make the reader feel disconnected from the environment around the character. So zooming out and showing the full body for a character. It doesn't even have to be your main character, but just show full body characters on every spread will help you to include more of the setting and also to show the full silhouette of these characters so that your audience will really get like the full experience of seeing your characters moving around and interacting with the world. This is a rule that I'm loosey-goosey with, so I do break it sometimes, but I'm conscious about it. Like, I've had this specific goal for years, so when I do break that rule, it's very intentional and it makes the scene feel even like closer to the character or lets me accomplish something entirely different. I had one scene I drew recently where the character was nervous, and so instead of showing full bodies, I like zoomed into all of these little details around the room, like doorknobs, and it was actually a character's feet, so I guess technically that follows the rule, but just like these little snapshots of the things that he's looking at because he's too nervous to like really take in everything around him. So you can find creative ways to break this rule too that add to the tone and really like amp up the storytelling of your comic. Or it can even simply be to have a talking head scene where the conversation is what's important and you don't want other details to get mixed into it. So my second tip is to challenge yourself to use silent pages or sequences. By silent, I just mean that there's no dialogue. I think I was pretty good about this in my debut. I really wanted to explore showing more of the characters' emotions through having certain sequences just be completely quiet. And I really love the effect of it. It kind of gets you into the character's head and lets you really feel what she's feeling, or at least that's the hope. And in my second book, it's about kids who like start a podcast. So there were fewer opportunities for this, and that's okay. But whenever you can find moments in the story to not use dialogue, like lean into that. Not every panel needs dialogue, and it can actually be like really immersive to just let the reader focus on the artwork and what the character is expressing and feeling. Even if it's just for a few panels, if you're telling a story that really necessitates a lot of dialogue. And there are entire books that are silent comics. There's one, I think it's called Little Robot by Ben Hatke. That was probably the first like true silent comic that I read, but one of my professors at SCAD, Brian Ralph, has a book I think called Cave-In that's all silent. So there are some really cool books that you can look at that are entirely silent for inspiration if you want to figure out how to get better at just incorporating even a few panels here and there without dialogue that help you tell the story. My third tip is that you need some spreads and pages in your comic that are completely ordinary to establish a baseline so that you can create opportunities for contrast. When I was starting out, I thought that I should include a lot of panels at strange angles, not have everything parallel to the borders of the pages, that I should just have the characters breaking panel all of the time, having a hand or their head or something come out of the panel and overlap other things. And it just made it so that there weren't any pages that you could pair together as the ordinary types of pages. So now when I make comics, I try to have a baseline. There are pages that have 4 or 5 panels and a pretty reasonable mix of shots. So you might have close shots or full body shots, but the camera generally stays at the same height and angle, not, if the camera moves up really high, you're doing a bird's eye view looking down at the characters. If the camera goes really low, you're looking up at the characters from what's called a worm's eye view. And even doing things like that, you can feel like you're making a really interesting choice, but if it doesn't matter to the story, it just becomes confusing. So I think that it's okay to let yourself have sequences of pages where the camera's pretty level, the shots are pretty standard and not doing anything too experimental, and you're not doing anything funky with the colors or the dialogue or breaking characters out of panel, so that when you do choose to do those things, it feels intentional and the reader can trust that you're making that choice because it serves the story and not just because you think it's a cool attention grabbing kind of thing. And don't get me wrong, I do this kind of stuff, all these interesting things, all the time in my books. I really try to push myself out of this baseline, very standard, page layout that I'm talking about. Because if I were to do that on every single page, my comic would feel very staccato, bop, 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 bop. Oh, those were lots of plosives. That was probably very bad audio. I'm sorry. But basically, I just mean that if every panel is roughly the same shape and size and shot and camera angle, your comic's going to be boring. So you definitely want to break out of that sometimes, but break out of it when it matters, when it's a moment where you want the reader to really feel something that the character's feeling, or where you want them to pay attention because something important is happening in the story. My fourth tip is that it's great to learn how to reduce detail for objects that are farther away from the camera. This might not work for every single comic, but in general, I think it's something that intermediate to early advanced comic artists can implement more of. One, to save time, because if you're simplifying shapes and people in the background, then it takes less time to draw the whole comic. But also because if you spread out the same level of detail through the whole panel, through the whole illustration, it takes longer for the reader to know what to look at. So if I have, a character in the midground who's really important, and I want the reader to notice what they're doing, and they're in a cafeteria scene and there's lots of kids in the background and, lunch trays and maybe some characters moving around in the foreground, I want to be able to direct the reader's eye to look at the character I want them to see. There's lots of ways to do this, but one way is to get good at simplifying a lot of the artwork in the back behind the character so that they're really standing out against it. I learned to do this by studying what other cartoonists have done. I will mention Ben Hatke again because I remember specifically looking at his Mighty Jack books. There are some scenes at a flea market where the characters are just so simply executed. The style for that book is so beautiful. It's really scribbly. It's honestly aspirational. Ben Hatke's artwork is super gestural and has always been a huge inspiration for me. And someday I'd like to try to make something that is that fluid. It's gorgeous. It's not the only way to simplify background shapes though. Being scribbly like that, like I said, really won't work for every style. So look at a range of what cartoonists are doing to simplify distant shapes. This is a great way to just create depth too, beyond showing the reader where to focus. If you have very simple background shapes and more detailed foreground shapes, it's kind of a shorthand for how we see things. So emulating that within our cartooning is a great way to create verisimilitude and make the reader feel even more immersed. I do want to mention one other artist who's a good contrast to the earlier example, and that is Luke Pearson, who created the Hilda series. If you look at those comics and study how that artist simplifies characters who are smaller in the panel or more distant, rather than getting scribblier, they turn into very clean shapes with like dot eyes. So it's a simplification that is, in my mind, kind of the polar opposite of those earlier examples. And I think that it shows the range of ways that you can choose to do this if you think it's something that would improve your comics. My last tip is something that I've carried with me from just before I broke in to comics. It's a more sentimental tip, I guess, like a mindset shift that still remains extremely helpful for me. This one is about battling perfectionism and knowing how to continue moving forward in comics. Here's the tip. Love something about every panel. If you maybe don't love the shot, maybe you can love the character's expression. If you don't love the dialogue, it's not quite perfect, maybe you can love the way you inked just one line within that panel. Maybe you like the pattern on a shirt that a character is wearing. Maybe you think that their pose is really cute. You don't have to have everything in a panel seem flawless, but just find something that you like. And if that's your goal, you know, it is honestly really freeing. That means that if you have like 100-page comics and there's like 5 panels a page, that's like 500 things you like in that comic, minimum. So just try to approach it that way. Give it a shot and see if it works for you. I think that one of the things that holds me back the most is just worrying whether my comics will be of a quality that I really like, especially when I'm struggling with them and I feel like they're not coming out how I want. That can be so demotivating. And so thinking about it this way of just, I need to like one thing per panel, helps me to stay positive and to love my work and to love myself and to keep making comics for readers who will love them for so many more reasons than I can even see. So those are all my tips for today. Thanks for listening. I hope that something here was helpful. Let me know in the comments if it was. Drop a like if you're so inclined, and I will see you next time. I have a few more video scripts written already of some other comics tips, but if there's anything else that you'd like me to talk about, please let me know. Thanks, everybody. Bye.